criticisms that I did dare to write about this. And I wrote a second column the following week, this time about how this part of Turkish media started to demonize international media like Reuters, CNN, BBC, etc. And this column was very open critique to Turkish media, saying that you are all colleagues in a global context, and you are not going to alienate your colleagues outside. And then this became an issue of severe debate inside the newspaper, and this was censored. It wasn't printed by the management. So after 2 weeks of absence, I took a leave, and then I came back. And meanwhile, seeing the entire censorship, the Penguin documentaries in CNN Turk, NTV, etc., and people protesting outside these TV channels, I wrote an extensive piece about something that I wanted to write for a long time, a phenomenon very apparent and visible in Southeastern Europe, in the Balkans and Turkey, that media ownership and media proprietors, moguls in main conglomerates who have other business interests than only media, telecommunications, trade, export, import, banking, tourism, automotives, you name it. They are basically undermining the very fundaments of our profession, that they are entering business alliances with the powers through public procurement deals, contracts, tenders, and they are giving highest priority to their own business interests, going into these alliances where, in a situation where governments and power holders are also giving priority to their own political propaganda purposes, whereas the main mission of our profession, which is to serve the public as a fourth estate, a separate, independent, free estate, in the name of public, monitoring structures of power and social phenomena, are being weakened to rock bottom. This was a phenomenon that we, as well as some of my Balkan colleagues from Albania, Montenegro, from Serbia, all of those countries, and Italy, have been witnessing for a long time. But this became very visible and exemplified concretely in the case of Gezi Park protests, because there you saw very clearly how those relationships, what I call unholy alliances between media owners and government, basically brought journalism to its knees, and it became completely toothless and inefficient. And where you saw media, through their owners, part of the corruption, political corruption, ideological corruption, economic corruption, unable to allow or unwilling to allow any kind of investigative journalism. It had become completely impossible to cover corruption, and where you have a milieu where you don't encourage independent journalism or editorial independence. So this piece was published in New York Times, I think it was July 19, and 2 days after, my second column was refused, and the column, New York Times column, coincidentally appeared on the newspaper 2 days after. It was supposed to appear a week before, but the coup happened in Egypt, so they had to push the print of column a week later. I was told to go, and I was given the reason that because you have written this opinion article for New York Times, you're fired, which was completely irrational and ridiculous from legal point of view. So that's the story. But this I think tells you what kind of difficulties we in Southeastern Europe in general, not only in Turkey, are operating as journalists. Let me, since I imagine some of you, maybe most of you, do not have much knowledge about the media sector or journalism in Turkey, let me recap some of the history in broad lines. The history is long. I mean, Turkey, being an empire once upon a time, and having the diversity and vast amount of human resources in cities like Izmir, Istanbul, intellectualism pretty existent, visible on the surface in the 18th, 19th century, was one of the earliest countries that joined the tradition of journalism. So we have a history of 190 years of journalism in Turkey. It started 1820s, mainly by help of non-Muslim segments, tradesmen that, of course, needed that, as elsewhere with the empires, and then it continued. I will not go into details, but it was always marked by its struggle against censorship from early stages on, against sultans, their apparatus, which wanted to always suppress free word. But it was a journey up and down, and there was, I think, helpful to show how strong the resistance, professional resistance was, and intellectualism has been. And media, journalism, newspapers at that time, I think became more and more important in early, about 100 years ago, let's say it that way, when the first most important stage happened in 1908, when Sultan Abdulhamid II was ousted by a variety of forces joining their strength together. The Jeune Turk, together with the others, Armenians, etc. at that time, and other segments, declaring a democratic constitution. That was a period of immense freedom, comparable to other parts of Europe between 1908 and 1912, until Jeune Turk segments staged a coup, took over, and militarism started, which led to Turkey being forced to join the First World War alongside the Germans. But that period was the first golden period of the freedom of speech, where everything was out in the public domain, including, the earliest examples of feminist weeklies at that time in Istanbul and Izmir. And second period of, again, free word or free journalism emerging was during the occupation of Istanbul between 1919 through 1922. This was paradoxically, despite the occupation by the Brits, etc., of Istanbul mainly. Istanbul is the hub of media, still is, will always be. Despite the occupational forces' existence, I think by the nature of Anglo-Saxon tradition, Brits allowed a wide spectrum of print newspapers to come to print. It was a holy mixture of all sorts of newspapers, and thanks to that kind of spectrum, today, for example, we are able to detect traces and evidences about what happened to the Armenians, for example, in 1915. Most of these newspapers were freely covering the trials of perpetrators of that human tragedy that took place in Anatolia in 1915-16. And then came the Republic period, which was a new period of suppression, and everything was more strictly, staunchly controlled by the founder of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and his new established party, Republican People's Party, and being a Jacobin type of French-driven ideologically project, this initially was making the journalism subservient to this republicanism or Jacobin model of transforming Turkey from being a sort of monarchy to republicanism. And this was, I think, very critical period. But then again, in 20s and 30s, we see that clearly there were pockets of resistance and emerging voices that resisted, showed some opposition, allowed oppositional voices, despite the pressures and threats and harassment. So this tradition continued with the media, with the print journalism, basically given the mission of enlightening the public, because there was a clear disruption between, in French style in a way, like in 1789, there was a blackout, and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk wanted everything in the past, Ottoman past, to be forgotten, and the language, there was an alphabet reform, etc., etc., series of reforms, but all meant that people were encouraged to forget the past behind 1923. And this kind of new thinking meant that newspapers were designed, forced to become enlighteners, illuminators of the public for the new ideas. So they were organically, mainly, most of them, linked to the state and propagated for state ideology, which then later was called Kemalism. Then, after Second World War, with the introduction of pluralism by the encouragement of mainly the Americans, another period started, which was more pluralism, more diversity, and of course more free flow of ideas, but again severe difficulties because Cold War had started, and during the 50s we saw a new elements, leftists, Marxists, communists entering, socialists entering the media more visibly, and fight has become more intense and harassments. Then we had the military coup in 1960, which meant disruption again in press freedom for a short while, but then everything continued a bit more powerfully in the left and right divide in the 60s. In the 70s, we saw the emergence of Kurdish press, small pockets, although it was severely suppressed and also demonized, which was followed by the 1980 military coup, one of the darkest moments in Republic history, where everything fell under the oppression of the military rulers, junta. That time we could not really speak of any press freedom at all, very few. Between 1980 to 1982-83, it was basically emergency rule in Istanbul, where officers, colonels, generals were calling newspapers and telling them they just without court orders, etc., that they were shut down for 30 days, 40 days, depending on how much they disliked the content of that day's publications. So this then was again, as the Turkish story is, it's always up and down, and it's always coming back to the light, daylight. And this was stopped, and new period began in the mid-1980s during the rule of Özal, which of course meant neo-capitalism, liberalism, liberalized economy, which meant newspapers. Media in general changed character. As I gave you the example in the beginning of an introduction, new type of media owner entered into the sector. They marched in. Up until then, it was always, the British style, European style, publishers, publisher families, only in publishing business that were traditionally running those newspapers. But these new media owners started to be allowed to enter by Prime Minister himself, the Özal, who wanted to see more control of politicians of the media, print journalism, by way of cutting financial deals with these media owners, because he knew that they needed to have more incentives by the government through public procurement deals, etc. So I think this was where the damage to journalism started to become really clear and dangerous, because most of these new owners, bosses, had absolutely no idea what the journalism was about or should be about, and all they cared was instrumentalizing the media outlets in the service of political powers and bureaucracy. And this became even more intense when the state monopoly of audiovisual broadcast happened in 1993 by a constitutional change. And of course, it's very lucrative. Wherever you go in the world, people's interests are on television. Television is the main source in media, still is today. And that means a lot of ad revenues, that means a lot of money, it means a lot of power as well for a media owner. If you own 1 or 2 TV channels, entertainment or news, you have a lot of power. And they exercised it very generously against the governments throughout all 90s, weak coalitions, one weak coalition after another. And this weakness of politics was filled by these powerful, rich, and ruthless media owners to design and engineer politics, king-making or king-breaking, changing ministers and prime ministers, etc. But that was a poison that was injected into the both into the public and also to journalists themselves. Trust of journalism started sinking from early 1990s on. And also, there was another actor, third one in this, which was the military, who ran the politics behind the curtains, basically telling what these civilian politicians had to do about the main